Hello everyone, and welcome to our second episode of Runeterra Report, Mastering Runeterra's weekly podcast, filling you in on everything you'll need to know for the upcoming week of Runeterra at a breakneck pace. I'm your host, DarwinTheory, NA Masters player and two-time Seasonals attendee, here to guide you through the meta for the week of November 14th, 2022. Without any further ado, let's dive right in and explore what you'll have to keep an eye on for this week. Seraphine haters, rejoice! While the champion is still viable, her popularity has dropped off a cliff, which is a reason for many of us to smile. Her pairing with Ezreal and Noxus is looking just about gone for the time being, and Ionia might need retuning to be viable again, but the Shoutouts variant is still doing excellent, albeit with a limited play rate. With Vayne being much less prevalent, that Hexbliterator tech I mentioned last week is probably irrelevant for now, but it'll be important to keep in mind if the Bloodcursed Harpy decks ever return to the spotlight. For the Shoutouts variant, I'd recommend trying a few unique one-ofs that could all be great but may not be for everyone. Piercing Darkness, Aloof Travelers, Piltover Peacemaker, and Thermogenic Beam are all very solid cards, but I wouldn't include more than a single copy of any of them. Splashing unique removals can be very useful for the deck, especially now that Seraphine's level-up condition is so much harder to achieve. Your most notable threats are Quinn Vayne Fiora, along with the newly returned Talia Ziggs and Gwen Katarina. Outside of those, your matchup spread actually looks excellent, smashing the new Aggro kings that have taken over the ladder. And as for everyone's favorite tumbling terror Vayne, some of her archetypes have notably fallen off as well. Her pairings with Jax, Zed, Rumble, Pantheon, and Gwen have all tanked catastrophically, but there's still something to be happy about for any of you tumbling aficionados out there. Vayne PNZ with Quinn and Fiora is still just as dominant as it was last patch, and it shows no signs of slowing down. On top of that, Vayne Kayn is a sleeper deck. It's storming the ladder with a near 60% win rate at the time of recording. To tech Vayne PNZ, I've got a few suggestions. Chempunk Pickpocket's play rate has fallen to negligible levels in this deck, but I still believe that it's a very solid card that can give you the edge on aggressive matchups, forcing them to block when they'd otherwise prefer not to. Forged Chief is just as solid as it was last week, and thankfully is making it into far more decks now. The same is true with a single copy of Fiora. It makes the archetype way better, and I would highly recommend adding one if you're still stuck in the past and running the 3-3 Vayne Quinn split. My only other recommendations are single copies of Parts Made Whole and Concerted Strike. They won't be for everyone, but they can add some interaction and longevity to the deck and make your game plan feel a tad less linear. Vayne Kayn is still quite far from solved, and I'd recommend experimenting with the Cultist package to see where it takes you. Lunari Cultist, Ambitious Cultist, and the Unforgiving Cold all look fantastic, but none of them are played more than around a third of the time in this archetype. The decks have clashing matchup spreads, with Kayn generally being far more polarizing and preferring to face aggressive or combo-oriented lists. Vayne Quinn is likely more stable and probably better to climb with, but it's a good idea to try both and see which one of the Vayne variants you like more. And I'm sure all of you at home will be quite happy to know that that's all the Vayne and Seraphine will cover for today. Now for what's brand new, or very old and experiencing a comeback. The first and most important deck to talk about in this new meta is Zoe Teemo Elusives. 1 week's spice is the next week's standard, as these merry misfits have managed to make themselves into a magnificent meta menace this Monday. Zoe and Teemo are still just as polarizing as ever, but they face a lot more great matchups than they do terrible ones this time around. Teemo Zoe relentlessly abuses nearly every single slower deck, with the exception of Noxus control, but it can falter when it gets outraced by more aggressive archetypes. While I generally think this particular card is terrible, this is the one archetype where I'd recommend experimenting with Draconic Bans. It's played less than 10% of the time, but it can spike your win rate drastically if you add 1 or 2. Shield Vault can also be good to stun a single elusive blocker while adding a bit of extra damage and durability to one of your own elusive threats, as long as you don't mind spending the action. My last recommendation is We Stand Together. While not nearly as good as Battle Bonds, it can serve a similar purpose for you for a much more manageable mana cost if need be. I'm not sure if this deck will continue to be quite so dominant all throughout the rest of the patch, but for the time being, this is the absolute best deck to climb with in my opinion. Games are quick, and you'll win a lot more than you lose as long as you're competent. We've seen the return of more than one classic on this patch, but the first and most important to mention is undoubtedly the classic discard aggro. Draven and Jinx have finally returned after spending a long time apart, and they're looking as legit as it gets. The deck can struggle against heavier removal and interaction, but absolutely demolishes any other aggressive deck that can't outrace it. You crush Zoe Teemo, Jinny, Ephemerals, Talia Ziggs, that godforsaken Reavers Row abomination, and Gwen Katarina. But you'll struggle against Shadow Isle's control and certain anti-aggro mid-range lists like Celesbians. Draven is critical to the deck's success in matchups where he can't be easily removed, and 1 or 2 copies of Draven's biggest fan are actually looking great in this deck, which is something we haven't seen in a long time. There are plenty of other generally good aggro cards that haven't made it into every list, as we haven't actually solved the revived discard aggro yet, but I'd recommend Legion Rearguard, Precious Pet, and Noxian Fervor. We all know these 3 are classic Noxus aggro staples, but for some reason they haven't been present in many of the lists. I'm of the opinion that this deck needs to be able to fill up the board as quickly as possible to succeed, and aggressive 1-drops are never a bad thing to have in that sort of deck. As time goes on, the community will certainly be able to refine and solve Jinx discard aggro, but for the time being, there's plenty of wild experimentation left to be done. While it's changed very little from last patch, Privateers, that's Misfortune Swain, is still absolutely tearing up the ladder in win rate. It really only suffers against Ekko Jinx and the Shadow Isle's control piles while dominating many of the meta staples. This is the first and only deck of the week for which I can actually offer no tech suggestions, as it's seemingly become airtight. Zap Sprayfin should be a 3 of if you aren't running her, but almost every deck already does. The only deck building question left for these sailors right now is whether they want to include 2 or 3 Leviathans in their battle fleet. That being said, Privateers are still one of the best decks to climb with, and the favorable matchups into Teemo Zoe, Discard Aggro, and Jinny make this deck especially scary right now. As I predicted during last week's report, Annie Jhin has come out reinvigorated after the patch. Having faced a grand total of 0 nerfs, and now looking at a far stronger matchup spread, Blazing Brat and Bullet Buff have shown that they've still got it. There are a few terrible matchups to be sure, but there are more than enough great matchups to make up for it and move the needle in the right direction. Sigil of Malice is still just as great for some cheeky burn as it was last week, and it seems as though the recently released Ionia follower The Witness is actually performing really well if you add 2 copies to the deck, which does sort of make sense given that skills can proc flow and Jhin loves his stun chains. There's not too much more to talk about given how little this deck changes from week to week, but I would recommend it a lot more than I did last time around thanks to its matchups being far better. And one of the most bizarre decks that we've seen in recent memory has suddenly jumped to the spotlight with this Jinx buff. Jinx Ekko Shurima looks to empty its hand with Predicts to turbo level both champions while filling the board, then uses Voice of the Risen, the Absolver, and the very powerful level ups of both champions to close out the game. As with many of the decks early on in the patch, you're looking at a very polarizing matchup spread here, with many matchups being less than 45% or higher than 55% win rate. While this deck does lose to Teemo Zoe, it beats many other popular archetypes, in particular the dominant Noxus aggro lists, Discard and Jinny. My recommendations for inclusions are Forge Chief and Eager Apprentice. This is a deck that needs to spend as many cards as possible in a very short time, and having units that pay for themselves in mana is absolutely essential to leveling up your Jinx in a timely manner. It'll be interesting to see how well this arcane pair holds up as time goes on, but for the time being, they're absolutely legit, and worth investing some time into if crazy combos are your style. After a lengthy break from the spotlight throughout the latter half of patch 3.18, Norra's Shadow Isle's control is back in many different flavors. While I can't go super in-depth for each of them, Norra has found profitable pairings with Heimerdinger, Elise, Kindred, and Veigar all in the spooky region. We saw Heimer and later Veigar earlier on in the last patch, but there are a few new faces joining Norra's spooky tea party for patch 3.19. Heimerdinger versions tend to prefer more spells, since Heimer himself can give you more units to help your board presence. Veigar versions can go a bit heavier on the board, since Veigar and his followers produce removal for you in the form of darkness. Elise gets you blockers on the board early to shut down aggro, and Kindred complements your removal by helping to get rid of backline engines or cut down tall mid-range boards through their mark. It should be noted that the Kindred version has found the most success running 3 copies of Go Hard. If you aren't playing that, incorporate those into your game plan. It makes your deck so much better. For Heimerdinger, Sneezy Biggledust and Yordle Captain can give you some stats on the board to help you out when it comes time to close out the game. Elise also loves Biggledust, and it's very easy to trigger Black Spear in that version, making it an exceptional removal. As per usual with Veigar decks, Stress Defense acts as a flexible and useful protection when you're running him, and he also likes units that generate darkness for him, in particular Dark Bulb Acolyte. Norra's Spooky Tea Party seems to grow with every patch, and I'd highly recommend experimenting with each of the variants I've just mentioned to find out which one is the best for your local meta and which one you prefer to play. And next up, a combo deck back from the dead to terrorize the current meta. Talia Zig's Bandle is back in town and wreaking havoc on poor Norra. The destructive pair ruins every single Norra control archetype, so if the Spooky Tea Party continues to grow in popularity, they'll have to try and find some way to contend with the raw explosiveness that this buffed landmark destruction deck brings to the table. Talia Ziggs does get outraced by several popular decks, including an absolutely terrible 25% win rate into Zoe Teemo elusives, but when the meta shifts to be slower, it will be critical to keep these two in mind. Wastewalker is fantastic to further improve your odds against slow decks, creating an ever-growing threat that must be dealt with. The buffed Safety Inspector is fantastic, and a huge part of the reason that the deck is now viable, so I wouldn't ever recommend including less than 2 copies. Otherwise, this is a reasonably tight list, but one that could become dominant if the Shadow Isles attrition decks get a little too popular. Speaking of buffed cards, Ravenbloom Conservatory is back, and Annie couldn't be any happier about it. The Ravenbloom Noxus Bilgewater removal deck is just as strong as ever, and TF has found a new Noxian to join up with after his awkward and messy breakup with Misfortune, where Swain sailed away with her. Most decks include 1 copy of Katarina, and I won't tell you directly not to do so, but stats indicate that this may be better as a 3-3 split with TF and Annie. Try it and see how you feel. Culling Strike won't always be useful, but can work fantastically as a one-of if your matchups mandate it. House Spider is just as solid as ever in these Noxus Bilgewater tempo control decks, and I believe that the consistency of House Spider is actually just far better than the inherent risk associated with Marai Warden when your deck isn't as aggressive in nature and you don't need the tempo. If you happen to be running into a lot of mid-range, as uncommon as that is right now, or decks that rely on landmarks like Talia Ziggs, a single copy of Scorched Earth can look great. The Card Sharp and Kindergartner crush their 7 most popular matchups with win rates above 55%. Most of them are actually above 60%, and it really seems like this might become the best deck in the game if something kicks out all of these Shadow Isles control decks. Speaking of decks that are close to a breakout, I know the stats don't support it, but I'm still a believer in Pantheon Varus. The deck struggles incredibly hard against Zoe Teemo, Discard, and Jhin, which are its 3 most popular matchups, but outside of those, the deck only really falls short to Celesbians and the plummeting Ephemerals. The list is still just as tight as it was last week, but I need to remind you all again to run a single copy of Ayula. Like I said last week, you can't always have the Expanse's protection, and the development is incredibly useful while protecting a champion. Once the meta shifts a bit and gets more refined, some or all of those 3 dominant aggro decks might fall out of meta, and Pantheon Varus could be absolutely terrifying if that's the case. It's not great right now, but keep your eye out. And now to return to another golden oldie. Heimer Jayce Shadow Isles, a relic of a bygone era for all of us that remember it, has finally returned, and it's looking solid enough for now. It has unfairly good matchups against all 3 of the aggro kings, but it does face a pretty terrible struggle against most other meta combinations. 2 of its other best matchups are against Reavers, Row, and Ephemerals, decks that are projected to soon plummet. They're terrible. Aftershock, Glimpse Beyond, and High Note all perform very well, but you might only want 1 or 2 copies of each. Personally, I would much rather learn some variant of Spooky Tea Party before I pick up Heimer Jayce, but it's a nice little flash in the pan for the nostalgics out there if you're running into plenty of elusive, discard, and Jinny players. And just as barely relevant as ever, Katarina Gwen keeps hanging on in the fringes of the meta. Never quite gone, but never quite dominant either. It seems as though more aggressive, high-tempo versions of the list are performing best right now, with 3 copies of Legion Rearguard and 2 copies of House Spider both being uncommon, but also both performing excellently. Another good recommendation is a single copy of Vengeance if you're worried about singular large threats. Katarina Gwen is a unique archetype in that it can be built leaning towards aggressive tempo or towards slow control, and it'll be effective either way due to the region combo you're working with. I'm a big fan of versatility, and the deck-building flexibility that comes with this list means that Katarina Gwen will likely continue to be almost relevant, or kind of meta, for many weeks to come. And the last relevant meta deck that I'll be covering today, Celesbians proved me wrong last week and showed that these 2 are more than legit. Their matchups only got better with the patch, and with the notable exceptions of Elusives and Ekko Jinx, the Space Babes have a fair shot at beating nearly every popular archetype out there. It's a very competent anti-aggro deck that can also get far too beefy for the Shadow Isles control lists to efficiently answer. There's been a lot more room for experimentation in the deck recently, with 1 Sunburst and 2 copies of Moonlit Glenkeeper being among the best cards that you can run. This pair has shown a surprising amount of longevity, and once those pesky elusives get chased out of the meta, there won't be much left to scare away the Stellar Sweethearts any longer. And to finish us off for this week, I'm going to introduce a segment that I'd like to call the Radioactive Hazard Pile. There are several tremendously overplayed and straight-up terrible archetypes that find their way into the meta each week, and I'd like to take this opportunity to steer you away from the hype if your only goal is gaining LP. To begin, do not play Talia Bilgewater! Aggro featured this Reavers Rogue brew, and it's currently, somehow, one of the most popular decks on ladder, despite its 41% win rate. This thing stinks like a block of cheese left out for a week in the Texas sun, and you'd be better off never looking at it unless you're just trying to have funny games. Ephemerals are also tanking like crazy, and even the best versions aren't worth playing in the current meta landscape. Sorry Hecarim, maybe next time. I'd also recommend not looking in the direction of Seraphine Ezreal. The deck was massacred by its nerfs, and you're basically tossing your rank into the incinerator the moment you lock it in. Well, everyone, that'll be just about everything for this week's Runeterra Report here on Mastering Runeterra. Thank you all so much for tuning in and listening until the end. Before I close things off, though, I'm going to give you one quick disclaimer just like I did last week. This is not a fully comprehensive meta report. There's only so much I can cover in 15 to 20 minutes each week, and I cannot tell you about every viable deck worth trying. Use this as a primer to prepare you for your own learning for the upcoming week. Check what's circulating online, do a little bit of your own research, and do what you can to help the meta grow and develop. I'm just doing what I can to cut down on the work you'll have to do to get ready to climb. If you have any questions or concerns about the podcast, please feel free to hit me up through the Mastering Runeterra Discord server or personally at DarwinTheory9305. Massive shoutouts to MasteringRuneterra.com for making this happen, as well as every individual affiliated with the site who helped me piece together the data needed for this podcast. Other special shoutouts go to the folks behind LOR.GG, as well as Balco's and Lycna's websites. Gathering data isn't easy, but when I can cross-reference with such reliable sources, it's a massive help to make sure I know that what I'm talking about is correct. The folks at Mastering Runeterra post quite often, so if you aren't already a regular, I'd highly recommend you swing by and see what's in store. We've got meta tier lists, matchup spreads, and a best-of-3 ban helper for you tournament players out there, all updated every few hours to ensure that we've got the best data out there. We also have articles posted by top players who know their stuff nearly every single day, so you'll be sure to find something you like no matter where you look. This has been Darwin Theory, and on behalf of everyone at Mastering Runeterra, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for tuning in and wish you all a successful week of laddering. I hope to see you back next week when the post-patch meta really settles down for our next Runeterra Report. Happy climbing!